I've been thinking a little bit lately. I was looking at some music videos on YouTube, and they were bands like Truly or Screaming Trees or Nirvana or Soundgarden or the Melvins, any of those bands from that time and place in Seattle or the Pacific Northwest specifically. And I remember what it was. I was looking at a Nirvana Nevermind rehearsal demo. Yeah, because I was looking to see the difference between Dave Grohl's drumming and Chad Channing's drumming. If you don't know, Chad Channing was the drummer that was on Nirvana's first album. Because if you don't know anything about Nirvana, they went through drummers like, how do I put this? Fat People Go Through Preparation H. And so whenever you have a band, change up their drummer, it usually changes up the sound a lot. If you ever listen to the first album, you can definitely hear the Melvins influence they had, or the Melvins' influence on them, and the total straightforwardness of it, and how Chad Channing had that sort of feel. But even when I was listening to the demo, it didn't have the punch that Dave Grohl had, but it nonetheless was basically the same drumming that you hear on the Nevermind album, because Dave Grohl pretty much copied it. Which is not a bad thing. Dave Grohl's a fantastic drummer, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying a lot of people should shit on Chad Channing's drumming skills, but he really is not that bad of a drummer. With that being said, I saw a comment on there, and it said, "Grunge is not dead, it is resting." And this got me to think, I have this problem with people referring to that musical movement as grunge. I only refer to it as grunge simply because it's easy to identify it as such. But I disagree with the notion that grunge in and of itself is a genre of music. It really is more like was more like a movement, just like punk rock, in the sense that punk rock, it can in a sense be revived over time, and in my eyes it's dead, but that's really an opinion. I really take the strong, the strong stance that grunge never was and is no more. The problem I have with the term grunge is that whenever you have a genre, specifically a subgenre of music, the bands that are in that genre, or the artists, if you will, if it's just one person or not, they are similar. They're not the same, although sometimes they are. They're similar. For example, thrash metal music. If you listen to thrash metal, you listen to the first Anthrax album and the first Megadeth album. They're not the same, but for fuck's sake, they're very similar. They're similar to the points where you can say, like, yeah, those are both metal bands. Specifically, they are both thrash metal bands, because that's the sound. Fast drum beats with a that's how it was. That was the bass drum that I just did, by the way. And, they usually talked about moshing and rocking and all this shit. But whenever you have grunge, listen to Soundgarden's first album, and then listen to Green River's album. They are not the same. You can listen to Pearl Jam's first album, and then listen to Truly, their first album. They're not the same. Listen to Love Battery's first album, then listen to Tad's first album. They are not the same. Now, there is one similarity between all of these bands, and that is that they are from the same area. Now, if you know anything about music, you know that whatever area you live in, whatever environment, it affects you. It affects how you think, how you act, the music you make, even the style you've grown accustomed to. Now, Sub Pop definitely spread this idea that grunge is in and of itself a single identity, but it is not a musical identity, it is a cultural identity. Now, when people say grunge is resting, I can agree with it on a cultural level, saying that there will be another revolution in the future that is similar to grunge in the sense that it's the anti-pop pop bands. When you get down to it, a lot of the popular grunge bands took very similar time structures and time signature, or not, musical song structures and time signatures, and just did what they wanted with the format. In the underground world, the Melvins took typical hardcore punk and they slowed it down and they made it heavy, because they were very much influenced by this album. So this idea that grunge is a musical thing, a musical phenomenon, is only half true. Because when you get down to it, the only thing that grunge really had that was similar, like all the bands that really had, was that their image, which was produced, by the way, by Sub Pop and by the major labels that supported these bands. This idea that they were anti-glam, nasty, grungy people, that was, the labels made that seem like a conscious effort on by the bands. But the bands were just lazy. They've even said, you know, we didn't want to be like that. You know, Kurt Cobain was sold by Sub Pop as some sort of redneck hick that was like a savant genius from Aberdeen. He didn't want to be seen like that. None of them wanted to be seen as these derelicts of society. Yeah, I hope I'm using that word right. And people caught on to that. They caught on to it and they said, yeah, this is grunge. Wear some plaid, don't shower for a week, and then play like sludgy pop music. It is so it's so frustrating for me to try and explain this to someone, because I've spent a lot of my life in the Pacific Northwest, specifically a lot of my life in Tacoma, Washington. And you just know, if you've been up there, you know, if you've been to Seattle, if you've been to Aberdeen, if you've been to Montesano, if you've been to Tacoma, if you've been to Spokane and Olympia, you know how the environment is. If you've been to Portland, Oregon, you know how the environment is. You know how it affects you. You know the kind of music that's up there, and you know exactly where those bands are coming from, and that is the only similarity. Musically speaking, grunge does not exist. It never has. To suggest that it has is only showing your naivete in believing major labels, or independent labels in the case of Sub Pop, or your ignorance. And that is really all I have to say. Grunge is not dead, but it never lived in the first place.